Wow. Assalamu alaikum. Bonsoir. Good evening, everyone. I am very excited to be with you today, along with our illustrious panel with Sana Saeed or Sana Saeed. Sana, sorry, I'm Arabizing your name. Sana Saeed, Mouin Rabbani, and my co-host, which I'm privileged to be a co-host with, Laila Al-Arian, and my name is Bassam Haddad. We are today going to be discussing the very important topic that has been in the media, social media, and beyond. We are titling Amsterdamned, basically the pogrom that wasn't. Why did the media lie? Our panel will address how the media were determined to amplify the claims of the political class that the events in Amsterdam were solely the product of a purported anti-Semitic culture by MENA immigrants, Middle East and North African immigrants. Contrary to all footage available, mainstream media's portrayal obfuscated the sequence of events and eschewed how matters were instigated by supporters of the Israeli football club Maccabi. Any causative relationship to Israel's genocide on Gaza and its club's hooligans was simply eliminated from the narrative. We have with us, as I shared, two speakers who have actually written on the topic, Sana and Mouin, and my co host is Laila. First, before we even do anything, how are you guys?
Hi, Bassam. Hi, Sana. Hi, Laila.
Hi, everyone.
Well, let's start with me giving the floor to Layla to say a few words. After which we might be looking at a video or a short. We're going to be showing clips here and there. So let's start with Layla, who will just give us a little bit of a background.
Thank you so much, Bassam. Thank you, Sana and Mouin. It's an honor to be with you all. This is a really important topic. It's one that I confessed when you asked me, Bassam, to join you, that I wasn't following as closely as Sana and Mouin. So I'm really grateful to have them here to really break this down for us. I was busy covering the, I think there was an election last week. Was it last week? I've lost all concept of time. But just today I was watching a CNN report from Amsterdam, in which the correspondent started by speaking to an Israeli Dutch lawmaker and she started out by saying, this lawmaker told her that Jews in Amsterdam are very afraid for their safety. They've changed their names on Uber. They've stopped kind of they've adjusted the way that they appear, their appearance, their dress. So really confirming every trope, every bit of misinformation around this story, that Jewish people are simply being attacked because they're Jewish. Of course, this is the central mis and disinformation of this story. And then she concludes by speaking to a Muslim lawmaker who also condemns anti-Semitism, again framing this story as if there is this wave of anti-Semitism that has suddenly hit the Netherlands, and then concluding by saying this Muslim lawmaker is afraid that young Muslim men or young Muslims in Europe who are consuming a live streamed, what he calls genocide, so she had to put that word in his words, live streaming of the genocide, that they're going to become radicalized. So it ends with this big threat of the Muslim radicals, and of course does not portray these genocidal songs sung by these football hooligans that came from Israel, saying that there are no more schools in Gaza because there are no more children in Gaza. That's not radicalism. That's not radicalization. The violence, and we're going to hear more about the kind of essence of the story from Sana and Mouin, perpetrated by these hooligans, is not radicalism. It's the potential radicalism or radicalization of these Muslims that we should be worried about. So kind of the hypothetical violence of the Muslims is given more credence and more importance than the real violence perpetrated against Muslims, against Palestinians that we're seeing in Gaza. So this is just one small example of news coverage that completely flips the story on its head. But I wanted to throw it back to you to play the video and then hopefully get into the discussion.
I'm going to play the beginning of a video that maybe Mouin can set it up for us.
Well, this is excerpt from a report produced by Richard Sanders. For if you give me a moment, please, I just want it's Double Down News. If I'm just going to look it up because I want to get the name right. I
Yeah,
wasn't
that's
getting.
right.
It's Double Down News, and he does a very detailed examination of how this was reported, and specifically how the available video were distorted to literally invert the story, and it's quite breathtaking the extent to which the major news media, the three-letter words or companies we're all familiar with, literally inverted the story. And when they were presenting a false account, it was very detailed. And then when they had to correct it to describe what actually happened, it became very vague. But I'll leave it at that since you're going to play
Yeah,
part of a video for us.
right away. Here we go.
Around the Maccabi Tel Aviv Ajax Amsterdam game has been sort of universally portrayed around the world as being an anti-Semitic pogrom. In fact, what it is an absolutely case study, a textbook study in disinformation. Now, let's make our focus here a very specific bit of footage. If you watch certainly the initial reports from the BBC, The Guardian, CNN and other outlets, they all rely very heavily on a specific bit of footage of individuals in the street being attacked by a mob of hooded men.
Crowds of people assaulted Israeli fans after Thursday night's match.
Israel said that Israeli supporters were attacked in a very violent incident as they left the ground.
Vicious attacks upon people purely because they're Israelis and Jews.
This was continuously used to illustrate the violence that Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters had suffered. The Times of India used Annette's footage and even went so far as to refer to it as Israeli nationals abducted in Hamas-style attack. Now, that footage was shot by a local citizen journalist called Annette de Graaf, who I've spoken to quite a bit over the last few days. Her footage does not show Israeli fans being attacked at all. In fact, it shows the precise opposite. The mobs of hooded figures we see in that footage are Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. If you look very carefully at Annette's footage, you can see that a number of individuals are wearing blue and yellow, which are the Maccabi colours. The people they are attacking are individual Dutch citizens. Annette goes online, actually says, no, hang on. The footage doesn't show that. It shows the exact opposite. She is ignored. She starts having to interact with various news agencies, pleading with them to change the way they are using her own footage. Firstly, Reuters, terribly important because Reuters provides footage to other news organizations around the world. With the footage, what Reuters distributes is a thing called a dope sheet. This is a basic explanation to their client. They're looking at what this footage is. Now, Annette spoke to Reuters at enormous length very early in the morning on the Friday, the day after the violence, and explained to them, gave them chapter and verse, told them exactly what this was. The following evening, they rang back. They clearly weren't terribly satisfied with this and quizzed her again. And she was absolutely emphatic. The people committing the violence here are Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. Now, I've obtained a copy of the Reuters dope sheet for this one.
We will go back and show a couple more clips from this video, which actually does encapsulate so much of the analysis out there. But before we get to that, I'd like to invite our guest who is with us not for the first time, Sana Saeed, to share a few words. I'll say a couple words about Sana. Sana is a media critic, former correspondent of AJ Plus, and host of the series Backspace and the Israeli Occupation Style Guide. Sana, welcome again to our programming, and we would love to hear from you. Your thoughts, your initial thoughts, even though you've written extensively on it and commented on it. So we would love to get your take.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here again, and it's again really great, as you said, illustrious company. Um, I there's so there my mind is just like racing with so many thoughts right now in terms of like what to say, and I think we'll get into a lot of it as the discussion continues. But and this particular video that's been shared, I think, is a must watch. It's a fantastic breakdown. Even if you know nothing about what happened with regards to the situation in Amsterdam, it is really incredible. He did a really fantastic job, and exactly the type of media critique and accountability we need far more of. But I think, to kind of reiterate what he was saying and what a lot of us witnessed, is that the coverage of what happened in Amsterdam, to me, while it's not necessarily surprising, because we have seen the way our US news media, European news media, and other news media have really kowtowed to the Israeli narrative without really ever questioning it for the past 14 months, not exclusively, but especially over the last 14 months. I'm still really shocked at the audacity that was displayed by the news media in really just, I mean, there's no other word to use it other than fabricating this story. It is completely fabricated, right? This is not like, oh, it's just maybe slightly misreported, or it's spun a certain way, that they took the facts and spun. No, they just ignored the facts completely.
And invented their own.
And invented their own, absolutely, and they explicitly lied about what was. I was awake when the first New York Times report on this dropped, and the initial, which they've changed slightly but still has the term anti-Semitism in it, where they said, like, anti-Semitic attacks in Amsterdam, and you're reading it. I read it. It was a few hundred words. It was the initial report. And I had been watching what was playing out, the previous few hours. I had logged on to Twitter late that day, and then as I log on, I see people on my feed. They're like, "Oh my God, the Dutch Moroccans are going after the Israelis in Amsterdam," and they're breaking down, like, all the footage is coming out slowly, and we're seeing this play out several hours later. Meaning there was ample time for these journalists who wrote this report, for the editors to look at who is distributing videos, what are the videos showing, so on and so forth, and kind of come up with a narrative that wasn't, hey, there's an anti-Semitic pogrom in Amsterdam. But that's what they went with. There was no mention whatsoever in that initial reporting, which was from the New York Times, and then other outlets started following, that, hey, this was started, or at least there seems to be an indication, right, that there is, that these Maccabi fans were chanting genocidal chants, that this is not something that just happened out of the blue, that there's more context here, and we're going to look into it and report on. There was none of that. It was immediately presented in the way that we saw the Israeli government, Israeli spokespeople, Netanyahu themselves, were presenting it in the immediate aftermath, which is like, this is an anti-Semitic pogrom. And we see then Wall Street Journal, ABC News, NBC, CBC in Canada, everyone kind of jump on it. And of course, the other really glaring example, as we see the coverage evolve over the next couple of days, is the Sky News example, right? For those who don't know, Sky News had actually put out a report about a day or 2 days after. It was a video report in which they discussed the fact that Maccabi fans had been chanting these horrific chants, right, where they're saying things like, fuck the Arabs, let the IDF take care of them. And of course, as Laila mentioned, which is the most horrific one, about there are no schools in Gaza because there are no more children to go there. They mentioned these chants, and the video and the report very much so are making it clear that this begins with the kind of intimidation and aggression and violence that's coming from the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. That video then is taken down. And several people note this, including Marco and Jones, who talks about disinformation on the internet. And within, I think it was maybe not even an hour or so, I don't remember, because it was all happening so quickly, Sky News reposts the video or the report, but this time it's different. And this time they frame it as though, no, these are not Maccabi Tel Aviv fans who've attacked and were kind of the starter, were the initial aggressors. Instead, now it's framed, the copy on it has changed. So they're talking about anti-Semitic clashes or whatever terminology they use, but they've inserted the words anti-Semitism into it. And they're also have now clips which include statements about this being anti-Semitic from like the mayor of Amsterdam and from the Dutch prime minister as well. So the framing of the entire report is completely different. And then we see Sky News kind of post under that in that second video, like, oh, we removed our initial video because it didn't meet our standards. And then they delete that too, which was a mess. But it really is an incredible real-time example of how stories and particular narratives are manufactured to, again, fit specific political agendas that play into bigger kind of political interests, right? So in this case, there are two, I would say, kind of political agendas at play. One, the first and foremost, is of course the fact that the kind of obfuscation of Israeli violence, and Israeli violence not only in Palestine, not only against Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, but also the obfuscation of Israeli violence anywhere else, right? It's this idea that Israelis and thus Jews, right, because they're always being conflated, are always victimized, that there is no place for them to be safe other than in Israel. And even then, they're constantly fighting these scary Arab mobs, right? And it's that reiteration of these scary Arab mobs. The way that October 7th is being invoked over this is also crazy, but that is very much so on purpose. Then the second kind of political agenda, if you want to use that term, that's at play here is this anti-immigrant, even though these are a lot of the young men in question, even though it was a group of diverse people, but a lot of the young men in question are born and raised are born and raised in Amsterdam. It's this fear mongering about the immigrants, about the Arabs, right? So this is a two kind of pronged racist narrative that's being put out here, which is this, that the Jews are the perpetual victims of these scary Arabs who will come after them no matter what the situation, no matter what the context, no matter where they are in the world, which is why the Jews, which is of course being conflated with the Israelis, must defend themselves at any cost, and their violence cannot be questioned. And then of course the second being like, look at these people who don't know how to behave in our country, right? And every kind of testimony that we're hearing from Amsterdammers themselves, which is not supporting the Israeli narrative, the pro-Israel narrative, is being completely shunned. And yeah, I mean, I want to throw it obviously over to Mouin, but that's initially what I'll say is that to me, was this surprising? No, but I am still very shocked at the audacity, the very transparent audacity of our news media to fabricate this entire story in the way that it was fabricated.
Thank you, Sana. I wanted to go ahead and introduce Mouin. Mouin Rabbani is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He was previously the principal political affairs officer with the Office of UN Special Envoy for Syria and senior Middle East analyst with the International Crisis Group. He's the co-editor of Jadaliyya. Mouin, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Laila, Bassam, and I think Sana just gave a brilliant overview of the media distortion. So I wanted to focus more on the political aspects. And I have to say, if attacking a bunch of Israeli football hooligans is a pogrom, then every stabbing of a Christian during a robbery is a crucifixion. It's really that simple. The Sana spoke about the conflation of Jews and Israelis. Well, there's also another conflation of Arabs with Muslims, because particularly in Holland, but I think also in Europe more generally, and also in North America, the discrimination and the racism is primarily directed at Muslims. I mean, people who either have no religious identity or are Christian Arabs, or as we've seen in some cases, even Sikhs wearing turbans, are identified as Muslims and then attacked on that basis. And what we've seen here in Holland is that it's specifically directed at the Moroccan community, the Moroccan Dutch community, at that demographic, and then extrapolated to include Muslims more generally. The problem is Islam. And so these Moroccans are kind of the most visible symptoms of this incurable problem, or rather a problem that can only be cured by getting rid of them. And now there's proposals to denaturalize them, to withdraw their citizenship and throw them out of the country. I mean, it's becoming very much like the way that the predecessors of these far right parties spoke about Jews in their countries during the late 19th and early 20th century. So if we look at the way this has been framed, both in Holland and within the axis of genocide more broadly, what we've seen, as Sana said, from the very first moment, it was placed in the framework of anti-Semitism. The reason these people were attacked had nothing to do with the conduct and actions of those people themselves. In other words, the only reason that a group of taxi drivers in Amsterdam got together and sought out these hooligans to attack them had nothing to do with the taxi drivers themselves having been attacked by these hooligans, because that simply didn't happen. And of course, in all of recorded history, there is no single instance of taxi drivers or any other trade group getting together to defend themselves and seek retribution against those who attack them and vandalize their taxis and beat one of them into a hospital and so on. No, the issue was anti-Semitism. It was Jew hatred, pure and simple. That's the only reason any of this happened. And so then you begin to get these kind of inversions of reality, where Maccabi Tel Aviv, racist, genocidal hooligans running amok through the center of Amsterdam with sticks and metal pipes and so on, and beating people, even beating not only people of Arab appearance, but also beating a number or assaulting a number of white people, attacking even police. That simply didn't happen. And the entire political class responds to this by, first and foremost, denouncing anti-Semitism. Well, anti-Semitism should be denounced. It should be denounced day and night. But in this particular context, where you had a bunch of racist, genocidal Israeli thugs attacking Dutch citizens and residents of Amsterdam in the Dutch capital, no one spoke out in defense of the victims. No, not a single prominent Dutch politician refused to place this in the context of anti-Semitism. It was all about, we're back to the 1930s. This is Anne Frank all over again. It was really, the demonization by the Dutch political class of a sector of their own citizens was really something to behold. And of course, others joined in on the act. Joe Biden compared this to the darkest chapters of European history. I could go on, but I think you get the general tone of it.
Thank you, Mouin. And just to follow up to that, what do you think, where is this coming from? This immediate kind of jumping to framing this as anti-Semitism, invoking the Holocaust, invoking the darkest chapters of European history. What is behind that kind of framing? What are they hoping to achieve?
Well, there's two, arguably three issues. The first has to do with the demonization of Muslim, or more broadly, or more narrowly, Middle Eastern immigrants in Holland and Western Europe, and in the Dutch case specifically, the Dutch Moroccan community. Again, very much akin to what we saw in Europe with respect to Jews during the late 19th and early 20th century. The Dutch parliament held a debate on this issue yesterday, and the only possible way to describe it was that it was a festival of pure and unadulterated hatred. The effective ruler of the Netherlands now, the far right leader, Geert Wilders, he makes Donald Trump look like a Bolshevik. Um, Trump wants to uh, collectively expel all the documented, undocumented residents in the United States. Wilders wants to expel, to deport a sizable portion of his own citizens. That's kind of an important difference. So, first of all, this demonization, this campaign against a sector of Dutch society. The second, and I think Sana raised this as well, is seeking to once again frame what is happening in the Middle East through the distorted lens of what happened here. In other words, what we saw here was a pogrom, which is really nothing more than an extension of what's happening in the Middle East. And what's happening in the Middle East, that's also a pogrom. What do you mean genocide? What are you talking about? And what's happening in the Middle East is that you have persecuted Jews defending themselves against genocidal Arab Muslim maniacs. And the third one, which hasn't been getting sufficient attention because it's much more specific to the Netherlands, concerns a power struggle within this country. There's a power struggle and also a culture war going on between right and left, an even bigger one between the right and the far right, and the yet bigger one within the far right for domination of that growing sector of the political spectrum. And so you get all these politicians grandstanding in order to kind of outbid each other with hatred, with vitriol, with racism, because it's not just their agenda with respect to a sector of their own citizens, it's also their agenda towards each other to see who comes on top. Because the Netherlands now has a strange situation where the leader of the party that won the elections, who would traditionally then become prime minister, was prevented from becoming prime minister because his coalition partners viewed him as too big an embarrassment to be strutting around the European and international stage. So instead, he appointed a former spy chief, a J. Edgar Hoover type figure, as a prime minister, a former social democrat, I might add. And so, who's really in charge? Is it Wilders, the head of the largest party, or is it the titular leader of the government, the prime minister? So they're kind of in competition. Then there's a competition between that party and its coalition partners, between what used to pass for the mainstream right-wing freedom VVD party and Wilders. I won't get into too many details, but I think you get the general gist of it. And that's also, I think, a key part of what's happening. And of course, it's being played out on the backs of the most vulnerable and weakest members of Dutch society, as these things often are. And what you've had now is a political class here, basically dragging their country's reputation through the mud deliberately, knowingly, in order to score political points, whether against a sector of their own citizens or against each other, or indeed on behalf of Israeli genocide.
Um, I'm going to play another short video or two with the chants that were chanted by the Maccabi folks. All right, and then we can continue. See the translation. Let the IDF win to fuck the Arabs. There are no schools in Gaza because there are no children left. And here's another video. I'm not sure if we missed sharing, but did we share, Mouin, that you are a Dutch citizen and you are
I am for now.
In Amsterdam now?
I'm in The Hague.
You're in The Hague. All right.
Yes.
So yeah, that's an added value, and Mouin has been able to read clearly the Dutch newspapers and so on. So we're very happy to have him.
Can I just interrupt you, Bassam, since you mentioned the
Sure.
Dutch media? Actually, yesterday on one of the main current affairs programs here, the Israeli foreign minister, Gideon Sar, was interviewed, and the interviewer asked him, and Sar began by saying, the key difference here is, and this is repeated by a lot of Israeli apologists, you had Israeli soccer fans going around perhaps making a few offensive chants or ripping up a flag. But then against that, you had these terrorists, these Arabs, these jihadists going around on a Jew hunt and beating people just because they were Jewish. And then the journalist said, but we have video images of and this is of course repeated by a lot of people. It was just a few offensive chants which you really shouldn't take offense at, versus actual physical assault and violence. And of course the reality is very different, but that notwithstanding. And then the journalist asks the Israeli foreign minister, he says, but we do have video evidence of your hooligans attacking people. And with a completely straight face, Sar says, I doubt that's the case. The insistence on maintaining that narrative of these innocent victims of an anti-Semitic pogrom is really a sight to behold.
And the reason, I'm just going to jump in here, the reason also why, right, they continue to do that he with a complete straight face, despite being told, hey, we have video evidence to the contrary, is that they know that ultimately when that initial narrative is out, when that initial framing is out, whatever comes and is said after the fact, it doesn't matter as much. For those of us who work, especially in the news media, but even if you're just an observer, you know that the initial framing of any story is what people will remember onwards. Not everyone is like us, who's going to be super online, following the story religiously. Where is this going, etc. They're going to catch a glimpse of a headline and be like, oh God, here's what's happening in Amsterdam. A bunch of Jews were attacked for simply being Jewish. They're not going to get the whole story. And that is what the Israelis know extremely well, which is one of the reasons why their propaganda to a lot of us, we're like, this is awful. But it is awful, awful, very transparent propaganda that, to those of us who are, again, keen observers of it, see through it very transparently. But the reason why they keep doing it and is because they keep getting away with it, right? Is because no one is really pushing back in any significant way from the get-go. From the get-go, there is no questioning of the Israeli narrative. Instead, whatever the Israelis say is sacrosanct, is presented, is never questioned. Whereas every word that we hear from a Palestinian, every claim made by a Palestinian, including what Palestinians themselves are witnessing day in and day out, is constantly put under so much scrutiny. Constantly.
Yeah, can I just make one more point about the debate here? There's been constant denunciation of anti-Semitism, and of course, there should be constant denunciation of anti-Semitism, albeit not in order to distort these particular events, but across the board, every politician has been denouncing anti-Semitism, but rather than also denouncing Islamophobia, most of the political leadership has actually embraced and encouraged it. Even the furthest, for example, the leader of the opposition, Frans Timmermans, would go is that you don't combat one racism by stoking the fires of another. In other words, the problem, what happened here, has to be understood through the prism of anti-Semitism. But the denunciation of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, which is what was really at stake in terms of these attacks by the Israeli thugs against the Dutch citizens, that's almost gone unremarked. And then the other point I would make, and why this narrative has been so effective, when we think of the Holocaust, we typically think of the massive numbers of Jews that were exterminated in Poland and Soviet Union, the Baltics, and so on. And that is indeed where the largest number of Jews were exterminated during the war. But the highest proportion of Jews exterminated in any single country during the Holocaust was, in fact, in the Netherlands. A higher proportion of Dutch Jews perished than in any other European country. And Amsterdam was one of the main population concentrations of Dutch Jews. And of course, for those who are familiar with Anne Frank, she was basically betrayed, and she wasn't the only one who was betrayed. And so, this comes back into the narrative of, oh, you're letting this happen again by not letting our racist genocidal thugs rampage and run amok through the streets of your capital.
And we're 405 days into Israel's horrifying genocide in Gaza. And that's almost disappeared from our news media, our Western news media. Every single day we see on social media horrifying accounts, ongoing airstrikes, killing children, accounts of doctors being kidnapped and killed, and nearly 190 journalists now killed. So how does the manufacturing of this story fit into the kind of obfuscation or completely hiding away the genocide in Gaza?
I'll start, Mouin,
Yeah,
if you want
please.
to later. I mean, while we're focusing right now on the Amsterdam story, we are focusing on it because it is such a shocking example of something we have seen, especially over the last 14 months, which is, and especially this narrative, this manufacturing of anti-Semitism. That's not to say, right, before anyone clips this and says, oh my God, what's Sana saying? That's not to say that there is no such thing as anti-Semitism or anything of that sort, but we have to be real about how anti-Semitism has been weaponized, not only over the last 14 months, but the last couple of decades at least, again, in order to silence and suppress and repress critics of the state of Israel, right? Or anyone who even calls into question Israeli violence. And so what we see is that this narrative about anti-Semitism becomes less about the question of the structural safety of Jewish people, the physical safety of Jewish people, and more about, and again, this is the way that it is presented to us, more about the right of Jewish people, again, being conflated with Israelis, but the right of Jewish people to unfettered violence, to unregulated violence, specifically against Arabs and Muslims. That is what this has all become about. And which is why, as soon as, October 7th happens and Israel begins its campaign of genocide on the night of October 7th into October 8th, very, very, very quickly, within 24 to 48 hours, we start seeing the narrative of anti-Semitism emerge. And it continues. That has been a mainstay. And we see how whenever Israel especially is doing, it's been doing this for 445 days, as you mentioned, straight, but whenever there is extra attention being paid to the atrocities being committed by Israel, we see the anti-Semitic narrative pop up again. Let's not forget the context in which this story, the Amsterdam story, is being manufactured. It's been about a month and a half since Israel began its total siege of North Gaza, right? Which has been the total extermination of Palestinians in North Gaza.
And this is a wonderful distraction.
And it's a perfect distraction, right? Because now who was talking about the horrific stories that we've been getting, which we've been able to get trickling in by the incredible efforts of the few Palestinian journalists who remain in North Gaza, who are being targeted by the Israeli military. But who is actually talking about what Israel is doing and has been doing, especially for the last month and a half, right? All of a sudden, there was greater condemnation of a pogrom that never happened than there's even been about the fact that the UN just a few days around this on the same day that this was released as this was being called a pogrom, anti-Semitic clashes, et cetera, on the same day the UN, right, Office of Human Rights released a report saying that of the Palestinians who've been identified who were killed in the genocide, 70% are women and children, most of whom are children, most of whom are between the ages of 5 and 9. So what greater distraction from this really damning report, which we already knew, which we've known because we've seen it with our eyes for 14 months. But what better distraction than, oh my God, there was an anti-Semitic pogrom, which we know that, Euro-Americans, so Europeans and Americans immediately flock to that narrative because for them, there is no world in which Arabs and Muslims are also not deserving victims. And that's a whole other conversation. But there is like that belief that they're deserving victims and then they're non-deserving victims, which is, of course, like Israelis and Jews.
Can I just, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick interjection because we are talking about this and this is timely. I just want to point to two interviews, basically an interview with two parts that I have conducted with Ras Segal under the title Leaving Zionism, Embracing Humanism. And today at 1 p.m., which is 3 hours and a half ago or something like that, we had the second part, which addresses the question of the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, where Ras Segal addressed the challenging the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and its implications generally, but also on university campuses. And it's uncanny how so many of the statements being made today are a repeat of the same exact critique that we have leveled for the past year regarding the question of critiquing Israel or critiquing its behavior, or critiquing the state, or critiquing people that support it, and how this has actually been rendered anti-Semitic. So I just wanted to point out that you can review and watch these episodes or these interviews and everything that we are watching here at palestineandcontext.org, which I will have on the screen. And it's remarkable, the consistency and continuity, to the point where we have nothing else to say anymore. It's really about how the power machine has taken over and has been supported and undergirded by the media. It's almost like we are trying to, operate a lever, however you want to pronounce it, that is not connected to anything. So I just wanted to share, in case people want to go back to look at some of these conversations. Sorry, Maureen, go ahead.
No. I wanted to make 2 points. The first is the scandal that this game even took place. Because, and this is the responsibility not only of the Dutch authorities, but even more so of the international football governing bodies, FIFA and UEFA, who have, it's a story kind of very similar to the International Criminal Court. They've dragged their feet. They've refused to take any action against Israel. Every time accusations are presented against Israel, the response comes back: sports and politics should be kept strictly separated. That was the case until February of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Literally within 100 hours, within days, the Russian Football Association and every single Russian football club was suspended. And so you could have never had a situation like this with a Russian club, because they simply wouldn't have gotten anywhere near Holland. The other point I wanted to make, that I've been making about this pogrom that wasn't, if it was a pogrom, then it would have been directed not just at Israeli soccer hooligans, these thugs, not just at Israelis more generally, but at Jews. And given that this purported pogrom was carried out by Dutch residents of Amsterdam, the kind of missing link here, the missing piece of the puzzle, is evidence of any attacks against Dutch Jews, against Jewish institutions in Amsterdam, against their property. And on the same night that this pogrom supposedly took place, the Jewish community of Amsterdam held its commemoration of Kristallnacht in the Portuguese synagogue, which is a well-known landmark in Amsterdam. Many of the Dutch Jewish community actually originally came from Iberia after the 15th century expulsion from there. So, you can't have an anti-Jewish pogrom where virtually all the victims are soccer hooligans. It just doesn't make sense. But, don't ask questions, just stick with the program.
Thanks, Mouin, and thanks, Sana. I'm just going to play a short video which continues our earlier strand of videos by the same person. And this one addresses a comment by Alice Porter, which is featured here. So here we go.
News produces a very unusual report. It absolutely stands out from all the other reporting, not because it's an exceptional bit of journalism, it's a bog standard bit of journalism. It's an accurate description of what had happened in Amsterdam. And within hours, it was taken down, and Sky re-edited it and put it up again with a note saying the previous version did not meet their standards for balance and impartiality. And the most striking bit is they continue to use Annette's footage. In her original piece, Alice Porter had said,
Maccabi fans were seen attacking locals as a police car can be seen driving by.
By the time you get to the re-edited version, that script line has become
a video posted on social media shows a large group of hooded men dressed in black running down the street and striking people at random.
What has happened there, Sky News, who know perfectly well what this footage shows and had originally accurately reported it, is now pretending that it doesn't know, basically to lie to their viewers. And it's rather sad, actually, to see that Alice Porter was prepared to revoice this. You know, here you have the one journalist who'd done a bit of honest, competent, professional journalism on the Saturday morning, and by the Sunday she's clearly been bullied into revoicing it.
Laila, I'll give the floor to you if you would like to share any comments or questions. I have my own, but
Well, I wanted to mention that Senna actually wrote a kind of summary of all of this that we're talking about for Mondo-wise. So for anybody watching and listening, definitely check out that piece. It's quite comprehensive. And Mouin was also on an episode of Al Jazeera English's Inside Story, also talking about this. But I wanted to ask Senna, so we saw the Sky News example is quite an egregious example of the news literally being rewritten and reframed in before our eyes. But can you talk to us about what happened also with the New York Times?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I happened to be awake when the New York Times dropped its initial reporting on what was happening in Amsterdam. Two of the reporters, there were three reporters on the byline. Their names are escaping me at the moment. It was my introduction to all three of them. But two of them were based in South Korea, one of them was also in the UK. And as I said, the framing of it was completely that this is an anti-Semitic, attack, right? They didn't use the word pogrom, but they were like, it's an anti-Semitic attack. Here's what happened. There was zero mention. Now, this article, I think the report came out around 3:30, 4 a.m. Eastern. So at that point, there was enough footage out there, and there was enough also just testimonies from people who were witnesses who were saying like, hey, the Maccabi fans were saying this, there were the chants, et cetera, et cetera. There was, again, as I mentioned earlier, ample time for any journalist who was working on this story, any editor who was watching this kind of play out to at least make mention of that. There was the entire initial report had no mention whatsoever that the Maccabi fans were accused of, there's video footage of them, and there's allegedly, even if that's the terminology you want to use, of them, chanting about the IDF essentially killing Arabs, about these horrible chants about Palestinian children. There was zero mention of that whatsoever. Now, I go to bed. By the time I wake up in the morning, we see that there's been updated, which what they do, right? As they're getting more information, they're updating it. And that, I think if you were kind of go back in the Wayback Machine online, you could see all those changes that have been made. And I don't know if anyone's actually done that. They start adding a little bit more context. The New York Times also did mention the specific video that's been misused by everyone. And now if you go down, I think to that same report at the very bottom, they do have a correction, which Annette herself had actually shared online, where they're like, oh, we misidentified and we've got to confirm that these were actually Maccabi fans and not, or they said we weren't able to confirm it, but this is what the creator of the video has stated. So it's, again, as I was saying earlier.
Sorry, Sana, didn't they remove the video?
I think so. I haven't checked today.
My understanding is there's now a statement this video has been removed.
Right.
The video
has been removed, but they have a correction, I think, at the bottom saying we had previously posted a video, unless they remove that too. I checked this, I think it was earlier today or yesterday. Like Laila said, the time has become a void. But I was catching up on that. And I was like, okay. But as I also said earlier, it matters journalistically, sure, but it almost doesn't matter what comes after, because that initial framing, I also want to just take a step back and say, to me, it's still incredible with the ease with which our news media says that this is anti-Semitic, right? Like I immediately start thinking about how, again, any claim from a Palestinian from Gaza, from the West Bank, is always treated with like the most, with the greatest scrutiny you can think of. But even even if we want to put that aside, I remember in 2015 when those 3 young Muslim students were killed, shot in the head, executed, the type of conversations that were, oh, we can't call this a hate crime. We don't know if it was Islamophobic. 2 of the girls were hijab. All 3 of them were Muslim, Arab, young students. We knew like there was such a debate, even in the newsroom that I was working in, there was such a debate about, is this Islamophobic or not, right? There's this genuine, unfortunately, hesitation when it comes to talking about hate crimes or violence that is driven by hatred of particular religions and ethnicities, including like anti-Black crime in this country. There's such a hesitation to call it, but all of a sudden there wasn't when it came to anti this being quote unquote anti-Semitism. And to me, this also really is a great example of this argument that a lot of people don't like making, but we need to be making it because it's so clear, which is that, a lot that Zionism itself, which is, Jewish ethno-supremacy, is an auxiliary of white supremacy, right? It is something that comes within a very particular tradition, a European and American tradition, which is why we see there is this over kind of this the sympathy that's also given to claims of anti-Semitism as well, when it's very clearly not.
If I could just add one brief point also on the issue of anti-Semitism, yes, of course there's anti-Semitism, and the Amsterdam City Council has also given a very detailed statement about what happened on that particular night, where they also provide evidence of anti-Semitic expressions by by one of the taxi drivers. But to then extrapolate from that into this was an anti-Semitic pogrom. The other thing that's going on here is that particularly for the Dutch far right, for Geert Wilders and his ilk, who are very comfortable with anti-Semites, by the way. Some of his best friends are anti-Semites. Le Pen, Orban, his fellow far right leaders in Europe. His problem isn't with anti-Semites. His problem is with anti-Zionists, and they've been trying to also reframe European anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not something that was exported from Europe to the Middle East, but it was a phenomenon, in their view, that was imported into Europe by these Middle Eastern immigrants. And in the parliamentary debate yesterday, Wilders is reported to have said that anti-Semitism was invented by Islam. So, before the 7th century, it apparently didn't exist. And so there's kind of all these ulterior motives and agendas all coming together into this cauldron of hate and discrimination and scapegoating, where people are trying to hit multiple birds, if you will, with a single poison dart.
Mm-hmm. I also want to really quickly mention that what I think is really interesting, and it speaks to this, right, the manufacturing of this pogrom of anti-Semitism, is that, let's say you take out some of the other context that we know now, we knew actually as it was happening. I think it's also interesting that initial reporting didn't also take, if you're going to be cautious, right, as our media often is when it comes to so many other similar instances, there was no kind of caution to, we know that oftentimes when it comes to football fans, there'll be like riots, there'll be fights, there'll be things that happen. There was no kind of even caution like that, like, oh, football fans haven't won. There was nothing, there was not even that kind of caution. That the fact that the initial reporting immediately push this without any hesitation, again, speaks volumes about how our newsrooms are also thinking about these stories, and not just stories like the Amsterdam stories, but also stories that are coming out of Gaza, right? This is their kind of frame of reference.
Well, just on that point, if I can just add very briefly, football riots are usually between hooligans affiliated with the opposing teams. Ajax hooligans and Ajax supporters were nowhere to be seen on the night in question because it was a clash, if I can use that famous word again, between the Maccabi Tel Aviv thugs and residents of Amsterdam, Dutch citizens, many of them of Moroccan origin. And it's not because they got together in their little Gestapo club and decided to organize a pogrom. No, it's because the Maccabi Tel Aviv hooligans, as is demonstrated by video evidence, um, went after these people the day before the game is when it's, and that's the genesis of this. And the real scandal here is that you have this journalist who was profiled in Richard Sanders's report, Annette de Graaf, and then a 13-year-old kid who goes by the name of Bender, who between the two of them, I mean, she works independently, if I understand it. He definitely does. Between the two of them, they put in more legwork than the entirety of the Western corporate media combined. And I think this is such a scandal, for the BBCs and CNNs and New York Times and so on of this world, that it almost leads one to hope against hope, that they've been so outshone by these two individuals, that it might even ever so slightly improve their own reporting. I recognize that's very aspirational and is exceptionally unlikely to happen, but sometimes one hopes against hope.
I have a question to both of you, since, well, to all of you actually, including Laila, but specifically, maybe to, more specifically to Mouin. We live in the United States, and we see these processes take place here. Now, how do we distinguish? How do you distinguish, or can we distinguish between the manifestation of this rush to implicate people in anti-Semitism when clearly there's nothing that is even remotely offensive to Judaism, Jews as Jews, or because they're Jews, and so on? How do we compare the European scene, or let's say the Dutch scene, because Europe is quite varied, and we've seen, for instance, the Maccabi fans in the football stadium. By the way, France is playing Israel now, or today.
And apparently,
not now, actually, earlier.
Yes, and apparently there have been more victims in France, victims who assaulted some of the French fans, and victims who apparently assaulted the police or something like that.
So how we'll get into this in the future. How do we compare the manifestation of this charge, to what is happening in the United States between, say, Holland, Netherlands, and the United States, or Europe as a whole and the United States? And where do you find it to be more cynical, Mouin, if from a sort of visceral point of view, because you've lived, of course, in Holland, you are in Holland now, and you've lived in the United States, or you frequent the United States quite often. If you can tell us your take, and I would love to hear Sana's take, because you've also been very global. Laila and I, and Laila as well, I mean, we've all traveled in all of these places, but is there a distinction to be made, and why?
a distinction between how anti-Semitism is viewed in Europe versus the United States. Is that
The mechanics of leveling this charge of anti-Semitism, and
yeah?
how it connects to the media, and the speed with which it does,
Well,
and the backlash.
Well, of course, the Holocaust took place in Europe, and not in the United States. And although the Holocaust was perpetrated by the Germans, they had a lot more help than people care to admit. It wasn't only the Germans, and so I think against that background, um, anti-Semitism had much more as a charge had much more weight in Europe traditionally, because it was immediately associated with the darkest chapter in European history. Whereas in the United States, of course, anti-Semitism was, well, once it became taboo after the Second World War, gradually. Of course, it was seen as a serious form of racism, but in the American context, almost trivial compared to the history of slavery, Jim Crow. That was kind of the main issue in the United States. So, but I think what's happened in the past few decades is that uh, it has been transformed into kind of a death sentence, if you will, by Israel and its apologists, where anti-Semitism has become kind of this magic wand that when you wave it, um, whoever is accused immediately becomes an illegitimate part of the conversation, is immediately silent. It's like the scarlet letter of politics, and it was extremely effective that way for a while. But very unfortunately, I think especially during the past year, more and more people are viewing it as an increasingly trivial and meaningless term, which of course it is in the way that it's being weaponized. But it's also very dangerous, because it's not like anti-Semitism has disappeared and doesn't exist anymore. And what happens now is that when it's kind of a boy who cries wolf situation. When you have real anti-Semitism, that will be dismissed by genuine anti-Semites as just one more Israel apologist crying wolf in order to silence the opposition. So it's the way that it's been exploited and weaponized and instrumentalized has done an extraordinary disservice to the real struggle against real anti-Semitism.
Did you want me to take that on as well, Bassam, regarding Canada, let's say? So I'm a Canadian, live most of my life though in the United States, but obviously I have family in Canada and still go there. I mean, I would say the charge of anti-Semitism in Canada it's a little different on a more like on the lazy things. So when you're just kind of casually talking to people, to Canadians or whatever, I mean, yes, it doesn't necessarily have the same heaviness that it carries in the American registrar. That being said, in our news media, in our politics, it is as heavy, if not more so, as it is in the United States. And this has also been something that's been a specific project of kind of the pro-Israel lobby groups in Ottawa since around 2009 and 10. Al Jazeera has done some great work on that. Fault Lines, I believe, also did a great episode on this like years ago, looking at the role of kind of the pro-Israel lobby groups in really pushing and Canadian kind of political class in the direction that it is right. Our Prime Minister Trudeau was among the first people to also condemn what happened in Amsterdam, anti-Semitic, right? And he said this is one of the biggest periods in history, and that and since then he hasn't said anything, of course, about what the UN numbers regarding 70% of women and children make up the Gaza. Nothing about that. Nothing about the siege. Nothing about that. And that is something, again, as a result of a particular political project that's taken place in the halls of the Canadian political class, 2010. And 2010 in particular, I'm because that is when we see the BDS movement in particular really gain ground in Canada. I was a student then, so I was seeing this play out in front of me, and again, with lay Canadians, I don't think it has as heavy of a charge as it would with lay Americans. In Canada, we do have very strong historical memory of World War II, but when it comes to our political class, kind of also, I mean, people think that news coverage in the United States is bad. I say that while U.S. coverage is overall because of actual impact on Palestinian human life, and the others as well, I would actually say that Canadian coverage overall is worse in terms of the complete silencing and erasure of Palestinian but also in newsrooms, censorship, talking about it's talking when you Canadian news, and it speaks to again the influence of very groups pro-Israel in Canada, pro-Israel narrative and pro-Israel politics in every facet of Canadian life. By the way, there's an option of the era as well of anti-Semitism happening in Canada. That's to happen.
Thank you for that content. I mean, one thing that comes for me is a documentary that PBS Frontline put out back in June called Christ Campus about what at Columbia and Harvard Universities in terms of what they called kind of anti-Semitism. And there's testimony by, or rather an interview by a student who Columbia campus protesters screamed Jews, I'm gonna get this right, Zionist, Yehudi, Jews, we don't know Jews here. That's what he told them. This was one of the most photographed and recorded protests in history. Students constantly had their phones that if as part of that encounter actually said that wouldn't have to be recorded, and there was of that. I don't think Frontline actually meant check that, because if there were video footage of that, it would have definitely included in what we know is allegations of anti-Semitism are made regardless of and I think what that does is very much cheap. I'm hearing that technical issues, so wrap it here if you have everything we're saying. Thank you so much everyone who joined. Jadaliyya, thank you, Anna, Saeed, Rabbani, for your contributions, and for everyone who listened to this today. Thank you.